Welcome to a video with Raederle.
In this video I'm going to be sharing with you 8 different realizations that I've had over the years about art. The realizations are actually pretty unique. I haven't heard them being bandied about in other videos about art, so stick around for those. I'm also going to be sharing with you my process in creating this ink, which is going to show up in one of my future coloring books, or possibly might get added to one of my existing coloring books in a new edition, as well as my process for my own coloring of the artwork. Sit back, relax, let go of your phone or your controller or your mouse. Take a deep breath and enjoy the video. References aren't just for copying. I used to think that using a reference was boring. Unless I was tracing it, what was the point? I thought that using a reference was basically a matter of copying and trying to copy exactly. I was mistaken about this because largely what I was trying to do in the beginning when I was a teenager was draw humans, particularly anime humans. The real power in using references is using multiple references of the same topic or subject. So when I wanted to get good at drawing mountains or waves, I used a lot of different drawings of mountains and waves to help me figure out what I was doing. I also spent time looking at pictures of the real thing and comparing that to the artwork to figure out how did they stylize the real thing to come up with this artwork. In the case of this particular artwork, believe it or not, I did have a reference. I was using a coloring book as my reference. I used the abstract artwork of a ship and a dolphin and a turtle and waves to create my own variation. I rearranged where the subjects were on the page, and I changed a lot about how each subject was drawn, but I used that reference to give me ideas for exactly how each curve should be formed in order to create a particular effect. This leads me to my next point. You as an artist don't draw particular objects. You draw curves and points. And of course you draw the connections between these curves and points. Each individual curve is actually a practiced motion. The particular shape of a pointy leaf is a specific 2 curves that connect, roughly like this. That's a shape I've practiced a lot. Start out with a pencil sketch. Make sure I've got everything the way I want it in pencil first. After the pencil is pretty finalized, I move on to pen. Now it's super important that the pencil's where I want it because when I'm doing the ink, I'm tracing the line that I mean to be tracing. If I have 2 different pencil lines kind of sketched in the same general direction, but the line I actually wanted was somewhere between those 2 lines, I might get confused and trace one of the existing lines, or worse, both of the sketchy lines. So I've learned that it's worth going through that extra effort to actually make the pencil sketch as close as possible to the finished result that I want to have. Your brain's actually very similar to a vector program. A vector memorizes the trajectory between 2 points. The reason a vector image retains its resolution when it's blown up is because it's using a formula from one point to the other to tell it what exactly the slope of that line is. Your mind is doing the same thing. You know within a certain variation that a particular curve is going to look like a particular leaf if you've practiced that particular kind of leaf as I have. This leads me to my next point. Don't draw humans. Unless you're passionate about drawing humans, just give up on drawing humans. That's kind of what I did. I drew humans for the first decade of drawing art, and I finally realized that I'm a really good artist whenever I don't draw humans. Our minds are wired to understand the human. We're wired to recognize tiny little shifts in a person's face to indicate what expression they're making, or whether or not they're a suitable sexual partner in order to procreate. We do not have that same wiring when we look at a tree, or a fish, or a unicorn, or even an elf, a humanoid that is not a human. As long as it's different enough from a human that it doesn't land in that uncanny valley space, then we don't perceive oddities in it as being wrong. But if it's trying to look like a human and doesn't quite get there, you get this uncanny valley effect. You really want to avoid that if you want your art to look good. After the inking is complete, it's time to erase all of the original pencil. It's really important to make sure that I hold the paper with 2 fingers in between where I'm erasing. Otherwise, I might accidentally bend my paper. It also helps that I'm drawing on cardstock. I really highly recommend this because it means you're much less likely to accidentally fold your paper somewhere in the process. It's important to be thorough here because stray marks that are accidentally left behind, I'm going to notice once I get to the digital cleanup phase of the project, and then I'm going to have to essentially erase those pencil marks on the computer, which is going to be a lot harder. After I've finished erasing and I've very carefully checked the paper to make sure I've actually gotten all of the pencil off, as well as all of the eraser shavings off of my sheet of paper, then it's time for me to move on to the digital version. Now I could just color on my original, but I don't want to do that because I want to have an ink version that can be used for other people to enjoy coloring as well. So when I'm done, I'm going to have two originals, my original in ink as well as my original in color that started out by being a copy of the ink. It's always best to get your digital version through scanning. In this case, I did use a camera because I'm traveling and I don't bring a scanner with me when I travel. Once the image is in digital format, I then have to go through an editing phase, getting the paper as white as possible and getting the ink as clear and crisp as possible. This is going to usually involve for me 1 to 2 hours of being zoomed in on pixelated bits of ink and fixing them. Tracing is actually really hard. Some people have the mistaken notion that tracing is easy because you have a reference that you're copying very directly. However, when you're trying to follow someone else's curves and lines and points, you're awkward. You're trying to follow their line, but your hand isn't in exactly the same position as their hand was. Your wrist is not practiced in the same way that their wrist was. And it's actually harder because where their motion was smooth and fluid and natural and practiced, your motion is trying to follow someone else's logic. It's kind of like when someone else is doing a math problem out loud, but they're doing it in a completely different way that you wouldn't do the same math problem. Tracing itself is its own separate skill, and it takes time. Like with people, hue does not determine value. In In this particular colored pencil set, the only purple was very dark and the only real blue was very light. In order to get a light purple, I had to be very, very gentle and careful with the dark purple and add a lot of blue. And there wasn't really any way to get a dark blue without sort of adding a little bit of dark green and a little bit of dark purple, because there was no dark blue in the colored pencil set. I wasn't intending on doing any coloring on this trip and hadn't brought any coloring supplies with me, but when I saw that this place came with a set of colored pencils, I couldn't resist. They say that practice makes perfect, but the only way you're going to practice is if you enjoy doing it. Another big tip I have is draw what you enjoy drawing. If you're having fun, you'll draw more, you'll get more practice, you'll get better. Let me give you another analogy to help you understand why drawing humans is so difficult. Like sewing with stretchy fabric, you have more leeway in exactly how you form each curve when you work with plants, earth, and non-human creatures. Drawing people is like sewing with linen, a non-stretchy fabric that's very unforgiving. If you don't tailor it exactly right, it won't fit right, and it will feel uncomfortable. You could also compare drawing humans to baking a cake. Just like with the linen, put the seam in the wrong place and the dress won't fit. Put in too little or too much baking powder and your cake is ruined. Drawing a fish is like sewing with stretchy knit cotton or cooking a spicy soup. Where the seam goes still matters, and the spice choices in the soup still creates the flavor, but you have more leeway in seam placement and spice measurement. As you can tell from the length of all of these time lapses, I spent a long time coloring. This is with a frame being taken every 5 seconds, being played back to you at 30 frames per second, so this is sped up a lot. Colored pencils is one of the most time-consuming mediums you can use, and it also requires a lot of finger strength and wrist strength. For this reason, it's no longer one of my go-tos. I now really, really love watercolors, and for this reason, I like to seek out coloring books that only have the artwork on one side of the paper, which is what I did in my coloring book, Waveward Dreams, because if you use watercolors, or markers for that matter, it bleeds through to the other side, and if there's artwork on the other side, you're just gonna end up with a mess. In my original, the ink goes right to the edge of the paper, but because of how I had it printed, it's not going to go right to the edge of the paper, which means in order to conclude the entire artwork, the print's going to end up being slightly smaller. So this here is the print, and you can see there's a little bit of white space here. One way to deal with this could be to crop it slightly so that it's the same size as the original, if that was important to you. Another thing you can do to cope with this when coloring is you can actually go back and add some extra line work on the edges in order to make it come to the very edge of the paper. In my case, when I did the color, I just didn't worry about that. Don't presume that you're not talented enough to create a particular image that you have in your mind. Everything I said about humans aside, It's instead better to ask yourself the question, with what tools or with what references or with what tutorial could I create this thing that I'm dreaming about? Because as I said, right, you want to have fun. One of the things that makes you feel really satisfied and feel like you've really had a good time is knowing that you created what you really wanted to create. So sometimes we have this idea in our mind that seems too big, like we can't reach for it. And we don't reach for it because we don't believe we can, and instead we work on all these other projects and we get more and more discouraged. Not necessarily because we're not making anything good, but because we're not making what we deeply wanted to make. So there might be a place for warm-up projects that aren't the main thing. I love using warm-up projects as a way to build my confidence on the way. But there's also a time, if you make time, to make what you really want to make. And there's no shame in having to watch several tutorials or having to use several references or having to create 20 different thumbnail sketches trying to figure out how it should work. Professional artists do this, and that's why they became professionals. They ask themselves, how could I be good enough to create what I really want to create? Even if you're not an artist and you don't aspire to be an artist and you're never going to create a masterpiece or anything professional in your life, I still highly recommend spending time with a coloring book. For the longest time as a real artist, I kind of looked down on coloring books as this like lame thing for children. I realized it's actually an incredible process for connecting with yourself, for getting in touch with your body, helping integrate your left and right sides of your brain, spending time in that meditative Zen state. You'll find that your thoughts will wander as you color, and this wandering process will be more natural than if you were just sitting there trying to figure something out. Some of my best ideas come to me, of course, while I'm in the shower, but they also come to me while I'm coloring. You can think of coloring like a mental and emotional detox time. This is when any of the stuff that might have been buzzing around in my mind finally shakes loose and falls out. The real me starts to emerge, the things that matter to me, the things that are interesting to me. If you're an intellectual like me, it's really important to find space in your day to get back in touch with your emotions. And most people don't really want to sit there for an hour trying to meditate. It can be so pleasant to just sit down for an hour and color and let your mind unwind. Give you another bonus tip, which is how to store your artwork. I find that putting your artwork on a clipboard and bringing it around with you like that is super hazardous. The edges of the paper are likely to get bent, but bringing your artwork around in a folder is also super hazardous. The entire folder can get bent. Simply by combining a folder with a clipboard, you both protect the corners as well as giving rigidity to your artwork, and that's generally enough. If you're gonna go somewhere that's gonna be wet, obviously that's not gonna be enough, but generally I don't bring my artwork anywhere where there's any chance that it's going to get wet. There will be no drawing by the poolside for me. So in this case, I now have a clipboard that essentially combines a clipboard and a folder together as if somebody already had the same idea that I had and they tried to put them together. However, it does actually make the clipboard a little bit harder to use as a clipboard, so I'm not sure that I actually recommend it unless you're really looking for extra protection while you're traveling, which in this case I was seeking exactly that. I hope you've learned something awesome in this video, or at the very least enjoyed watching this time lapse. I know I had a ton of fun putting it together. I'm looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts, questions, comments, ideas, inspirations in the comments below. I do respond to comments, and also this is the best way to reach me, so please, if you have a question, put it there. If you like this video and you would like to support my channel, please stop by my Patreon. It also helps my channel a lot if you hit that like button, especially if you also leave a comment and subscribe. looking forward to interacting with you in the future. For now, this is Raederle, signing off. If you really don't have a folder to put your artwork in, but you do have a clipboard and you've just drawn something, one simple way to help protect it is just to put it on the bottom of your mat of papers. And of course, your mat of papers should consist of, when you're drawing your artwork, a sheet of scrap paper, maybe multiple sheets of scrap paper, and then your clean paper for future artworks. And so when you finish the artwork, or when you're between drawing sessions, you just move that artwork to the bottom of the stack so that your scrap paper is now on top, and that's what gets messed up in some way if anything were to happen, hopefully.